Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. This is our special three-part introductory learning series, Early Psychosis 101, Basics for Supporting Students. We thank you for your interest in our learning session today. We'll get started in just a minute here. For those of you who just came into the room, thank you so much for being here with us today. This is our Early Psychosis 101, Basics for Supporting Students, three-part learning series. We thank you for your interest in our learning session. We'll get started in just a few seconds. We're allowing for people to get settled into the room. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? It's a minute past the top of the hour. Again, welcome everyone. This is our session 2 of our three-part learning series. And today we'll focus on hope, healing, and homework, empowering educators in screening for psychosis, and navigating school supports for students with psychosis. We have 60 minutes together today, and we're very excited to share this space together with all of you. If we skip over to the next slide, or maybe just another slide actually, we have a few reminders for our participants who are here with us today. All participants are muted and with video off. This webinar is currently being recorded, and we'll have the session slides, the recording, and certificates of attendance sent to you within a week. Please take note of the Zoom toolbox at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to use the chat box to share your comments throughout the session. If your comments are for all to see, please make sure to check the chat box drop-down menu and make sure that your chat response is going to everyone and not just the hosts and panelists. We also encourage you to use the Q&A box for any content-related questions for our panelists. We are keeping track of those throughout the session, and we'll try to respond to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of our session today. You can also click the CC icon if you'd like to enable captions for today's session. And a quick note that we are not offering CEUs for this session. We are only offering certificates of attendance for those who engage with us today for at least half of the session. So this learning series is presented to you through a partnership between the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network and through the Psychosis Risk and Early Psychosis Program Network. So for those of you who weren't with us for session 1, the MHTTC network is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. And the purpose of our network is to accelerate the adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices. We have a school mental health initiative, and we aim to bring awareness, disseminate information, and provide technical assistance and training on the implementation of mental health services in schools and school systems. We invite you to learn more about our network by visiting our website, mhttcnetwork.org. On the next slide here is just a quick disclaimer that the opinions that are expressed in today's session are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or our funder, SAMHSA. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Stephen Adelsheim to share a little bit about the PEPNet and why today's topic is so important. And then he'll turn it over to our speakers to officially get us started. Dr. Adelsheim?
Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for being here for this really important webinar today. Just quickly, the PEPNet network, the Psychosis Risk and Early Psychosis Program Network, was created now almost 10 years ago to provide support for partners involved in clinical programs doing this work to support those at clinical high risk for psychosis or with a first episode. We have a number of different work groups, including, and I'll highlight today, the adolescent and early psychosis work group, which really has taken on the initiative of supporting the earlier identification of young people with these early warning signs to link them to early service, because we all really understand that early intervention for mental health issues such as clinical high risk and first episode work well, and that it's important to be able to link these young people to early services so they can stay in school, stay in jobs, and stay productive in the work that they want to do for themselves. So let's go to the next slide, please. The next slide. So part of what's really important, and we're grateful to all of you to be here, and the reason we really wanted to do this series was to really be sure that all of you that are leading efforts in school mental health have an awareness and an understanding of the importance of this work, the importance of early identification for clinical high risk and early psychosis, so that you can help young people and families get those linkages to those early and effective critical supports. We want to be sure you understand also that this is an important national initiative with funding coming from SAMHSA as part of the federal mental health block grants to every state as a 10% set aside, as well as other additional funding over the last few years. SAMHSA also funds a number of clinical high risk programs across the United States as well. And in addition, recently funded a new National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Early Serious Mental Illness to be able to provide wider dissemination of training and support around this issue. Next slide. Just reflective of this fact is that as much as 10, 12 years ago, we had maybe 20 of these programs, mostly with our colleagues in Oregon, and now we are at almost 400 early psychosis programs across the United States. If you want to find the one closest to you, please look at our PepNet website where we have an interactive map, and you can see the programs closest to you to help with referrals for young people who might be at clinical high risk for or having a first episode of a psychotic illness. Next slide, please. In addition, on a national research level, the National Institute of Mental Health has been partnering through the EpiNet National Data Coordinating Center and the 8 hub and spokes of programs, which lead to over 102 clinical programs that are collecting common data through a common assessment system to help us all get a better understanding of how to more effectively identify and support young people with these early psychosis-related issues. Next slide. So today I get to introduce our wonderful speakers who have been friends and colleagues for a number of years, and really grateful that they're willing to share their expertise with us today. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Jason Schiffman, who earned a PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Southern California. He is a professor and director of clinical training with the Department of Psychological Sciences at UC Irvine. Dr. Schiffman previously founded and developed 2 clinical research and training programs serving people at clinical high risk for psychosis. And then we will hear from our own Dr. Apurva Bhatt, who is a newly appointed clinical assistant professor in our Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. Dr. Bhatt completed her residency training at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, at the Center for Behavioral Medicine's Adult Psychiatry program, and she recently graduated from her Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship at UC Davis. Dr. Bhatt also co-chairs the Early Psychosis Work Group at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So at this point, let me hand things over to Dr. Schiffman and say thank you to you, sir, and Dr. Bhatt for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much, Steve, and Jessica, thank you as well. I couldn't be more excited to be here with y'all today and to have the privilege of presenting with Dr. Bhatt, who has become a friend through all of this. I think that this work is really important, as Steve was emphasizing, and folks that work in schools and interact with schools are really at the forefront of being able to make a difference and serving some of our most vulnerable brothers, sisters, and siblings. And I'm happy to be a small part of this conversation. I watched the video, excuse me, the presentation from a couple weeks ago, and I thought it set a fantastic foundation for this three-part series. And hopefully you gain from it as well. If not, that recording is online, and Jessica can give you access to it. But it's really empowering, and does set a good segue into what Dr. Bott and I will be talking about today. Here are our learning objectives. Describe why schools are so important in early psychosis work. And I think you'll come to find that that's pretty self-evident really quickly. Identify methods of screening for psychosis in schools. And that's why I'll spend some time talking about screening tools that we can use, and some of their limitations, but also like what we're really looking for in terms of the constructs of early risk signs for emerging psychosis. And then we'll also discuss strategies for approaching disclosure and actions that can be taken to support students with or at risk for psychosis who are in schools. Little table setting here. I just wanted to give a definition of psychosis that's consistent with what I think we talked about a couple weeks ago, but a severe mental disorder in some cases in which contact with reality is lost or distorted. Psychosis is characterized as a disruption to a person's thoughts and perceptions that make it difficult for them to recognize what's real and what isn't. This is a definition that National Alliance on Mental Illness espouses, and I think this is really a good way to think about psychosis in a person-first, person-directed type of perception or perspective. And you can see here, there's disruptions to ways in which people think, and it avoids blame and biological underpinnings and the like. It just sort of suggests that psychosis is something that gets in the way of people being able to determine what's real and what isn't. If you think about the development of psychosis across the passage of time, and this arrow would indicate time, we can sort of break up the emergence of psychosis into three separate distinct categories that overlap on some levels. But if we were to suggest here at this point, this is the emergence of psychosis, when psychosis begins, or when a person crosses the threshold for symptomatology. And then some time passes and effective treatment is initiated. The duration of time between onset of treatment and onset of psychosis is called the duration of untreated psychosis. And in the United States, this lasts roughly approximately about 2 years, a little less in some places. But to me, this is one of the most appalling statistics in our field, in that many folks, on average, are going almost 2 years prior to getting effective care after having an onset of psychosis. Now, what I think the field is moving towards, and one of the things that I'm so excited that you all are here and probably interested in, is to be able to find folks earlier on in their trajectory. If we can find folks during this risk phase and work with them then, we can avoid all of the negative consequences that are associated with long durations of untreated psychosis, which basically are associated with anything negative that you can imagine. So if we find folks and partner with them during this risk phase, we might be able to alter their trajectories in really positive ways, reducing duration of untreated psychosis maybe to a 0 number, because if they do develop psychosis, we can provide a warm handoff to coordinated specialty care, some of the expert centers that work with folks in their first episodes of psychosis. We might be able to delay psychosis if psychosis is destined to occur, or minimize its ultimate impact, or in some cases, maybe even prevent psychosis from ever emerging in the first place. Now, in order to do that, we have to think about what we're looking for and also where we're looking for it. And schools, I think, are an ideal place for us to pay attention. Schools are important because the age of onset for folks that are having emerging symptoms of psychosis generally is around 15 to 25, where many of our young people find themselves in school. Nearly all youth who are at risk are in schools. And a lot of folks that work in schools report having interacted with people with psychosis. So 87% of surveyed school providers in one study reported involvement with a youth with psychosis. But there's a but here. It can be challenging to engage schools. So if you work in school context, or if you've interacted with schools, you'll probably be comfortable with the statement that I'm about to say, which is there's a lot of bureaucracy and things that get in the way of early screening for anything really, but certainly for psychosis. So things like trust and consent and assent and FERPA, privacy, regulation, stigma, really important barriers to getting psychosis screening embedded within schools. And if we can't find folks early, then we can't intervene with them early. And then the the positive chain will break down. So attention to psychosis is limited in school settings. And there's a variety of different contributors to this, but I think one of the main things is that our mental health systems tend to be divided into adult serving agencies and child serving agencies. And as a result of that, the way in which we train providers of mental health services is also bifurcated. So folks who identify as working with youth or youth serving mental health professionals, they tend to get a lot of training on developmental considerations, working with families, understanding schools, and the like. However, their training and exposure to psychosis and being sensitized to risk signs of psychosis is oftentimes minimal or marginal at best. At the same time, our colleagues who are more adult focused in their training, they get a lot of training in psychosis, but their familiarity with developmental considerations, maybe working with schools and perhaps working with families, the emphasis of their training is less on those areas. And all of this is happening at a time when our young people are at most risk in this emerging adulthood or transition age youth time. Meanwhile, as I alluded to at the beginning of the slide, our public mental health systems are split. So you have our workforce sort of split, public mental health system sort of split, and this leads to people potentially falling through the cracks and longer durations of untreated psychosis. That being said, I believe that psychoeducation in schools can be a real big part of the solution. So reducing duration of untreated psychosis. And our best evidence for this is a study that I would refer you to if you're interested. Those 2008 references there could get you some information about the TIPS program. This was done in Scandinavia. And what they were able to do with this really assertive marketing campaign and psychoeducation within schools is to reduce duration of untreated psychosis to just 5 weeks for folks that participated in the study. So this is a real solid piece of evidence to suggest that that if we connect with schools and we create less stigmatizing environments and increase knowledge, then we can really make inroads and make a difference. All right. So I thought what I'd do now is give you a vignette of what we might be looking for in someone that could be on the verge of potentially developing psychosis or having psychosis risk symptoms. And it's unclear in this vignette what's going to happen next, but some things that I'll sensitize you to, just to give you like a sense as to what we're talking about here. All right, so Candace reports a new and very intense interest in New Age philosophies over the past few months that's really consumed her. Since opening her mind to this way of thinking, she's noticed increasingly more coincidences in science. She frequently sees her lucky number 8 and takes this to be a sign that she's on the right path, moving in the right direction. Oftentimes, she'll change her schedule and follow where the number 8 seems to be taking her. She also reports that over the past 6 months when she's meditating, she'll sometimes sense a presence, which she thinks could be her spirit guide, although she wonders about this as the presence can feel dark. Although these things have been on her mind a lot, she told you she's just not sure what's going on and that it might all be in her head. So some things to think about with this. It's unclear as to what direction this might take, but there are some things that we could probe or learn more about that could provide some clarity. So the first thing that I want to emphasize is zeroing in on the experience. So what's Candace talking about here? Well, first, interest in New Age philosophy. So we'd want to learn more about that. Coincidences and signs that she's noticing. This lucky number 8, what's that mean? And what does it mean to be following the right path? She also noted, as part of her experiences, of sensing a presence. Again, something we'd want to probe more for. Maybe it's within cultural norms or something very typical for her and non-psychopathology, or maybe it's potentially problematic for her. And so we further probe with her. And then the next thing that I want to think about with respect to Candace's experiences are whether there's any distress associated with them. Do they cause any behavior change? And how intense are they? These factors will give us a little bit more context to understand whether those experiences are pathological or problematic, and or if they're just more typical of her and her subculture or her culture. So very intense, really consumes her. And then you see some behavior change here, change her schedule and follow where the number 8 seems to be taking her. And then this last part that I highlighted, presence can feel dark. That gives us some sense that there's some distress to her experiences. All right, last thing that I want to highlight is whether or not these experiences are new or stable and longstanding. If they're new, that sensitizes us to the potential development of worse symptoms or a negative trajectory that she might be on with respect to these symptoms. So in Candace's case, the symptoms were new, past few months, and the increasingly suggests that it's getting worse. And then the presence also in the past 6 months. So when we're thinking about novelty or whether something's new, we think really within the last year or so. Okay, so that's Candace, and gives you a sense as to what we might be thinking about. Now, who could think about this? Well, teachers are definitely an invaluable asset in this endeavor to identify people at risk for psychosis. Now, there's a study that we did several years back now, where we're working with kids who had a parent with schizophrenia, putting them at increased risk of developing psychosis themselves. We assessed those kids when they were around 11 to 12 years old or so, and we had teachers rate them as part of an evaluation at the time. Years later, after the kids grew up and went through the age of risk for psychosis, there was a diagnostic outcome for each of those kids that was determined. And one of the strongest predictors of the kids who, at age 11 to 12, grew up and then developed psychosis were the ratings from their teachers. So this is just one small study that suggests that teachers can be helpful in determining future risk for psychosis, but it gives us a little bit of evidence to suggest teachers can be definitely a big part of the solution for things. Here, okay, so if we think about screening in schools, there's a variety of different topics that we should embark on and think about to develop something that would be thoughtful and a good approach to integrating into the school setting. Things like who's doing the screening, who's bought into this, like, is there motivation or positivity towards the endeavor, any budgetary concerns, thinking, this is a subtle one, but attendance. So a lot of times the kids that are most in need have the worst attendance record. So you could do a screening and might miss somebody depending on if they were absent that day. Are you screening everybody universally, or is it just indicated based on some sort of trigger for screening? And then the one that I'll just spend a second talking about is what screening tool to use. I thought I'd introduce a few of these that might be of interest to some folks. Oftentimes we use the first two, Prime Screen or the Prodromal Questionnaire B, if you're interested in those, or would like me to share them with you, please feel free to reach out. But here's some other options. The first I'll mention is the Behavioral Assessment System for Children. This is called colloquially known as the BASC-3. Also the CBCL and the YSR, Child Behavior Checklist, and the Youth Self-Report from the Achenbach system. Those are both measures that are fairly frequently used already in school settings, and they both have a thought disorder or a scale that is specific to psychosis risk that are pretty predictive. So it could very well be that you're already using some screening tools that could get you the information that a person might share that would be indicative of risk for psychosis. Okay, so screening, I think, can be really good. And I think hopefully it's common sense that screening can be helpful, but it can help find folks that you wouldn't otherwise find. It can reduce that duration of untreated psychosis that I mentioned that was so important in this field. It can increase efficiency of assessments that are more structured. You can use these tools to monitor progress. And the act of assessment in and of itself is part of treatment and care. But a few cautions that I'll mention before my time is up. The first is, if you're doing screening in schools, know that there's a lot of false positives as you screen in younger kids. So they'll say yes to some of these questions on self-report measures. And they may meet yes, but when you probe and talk to them more, you'll find that they're answering those questions in a way that's not consistent with what you're really after in terms of risk for psychosis. So be mindful of your younger kids, because some of those screening tools aren't quite as effective in terms of their specificity. A lot of false positives. Next thing, in another study that we did some years back now, we found that one of our screening tools, the Prime Screen, wasn't quite as effective for some of our marginalized members of our research study. So our Black youth were less likely to be accurately screened with the Prime Screen. And what we found was when we spoke to our youth who were Black, they were saying yes to some of these questions, and it was an appropriate yes for how they were interpreting the question. But it wasn't an appropriate yes for how the measure was intended to ascertain information about psychosis risk. So they were talking oftentimes about unhealthy environments that they were responding to in their endorsements. So talking to folks is an important theme from both of these slides. If And so when you're doing these self-report or screenings, it's important to have a conversation. Now, with that in mind, I do have one very practical suggestion for folks. I was asked to come up with just 2 items, and so through some statistical analyses, came up with these 2 items. Do you ever hear the voice of someone talking that other people cannot hear? And have you ever felt that someone was playing with your mind? And what we found is that if someone said yes to either one of these items, then there was good statistical rationale to follow up with one of the more in-depth screening tools. Our sensitivity and specificity were pretty good for just 2 items. Then if they say yes to either one of those, move up to one of those screening tools that I mentioned before. But ultimately, what I think is most important is to have a conversation. So ask the question through self-report or however you want, but then talk to the young people, talk to your students, and see what those yeses that they're saying mean to them. And you might find that it's not a psychosis risk, but you may in fact find that it is. And then you can tailor services or the kinds of cares, the care that they might need based on what you learn from them just by connecting with them and talking to them. So with that, I want to turn it over to Apurva. So I'm going to stop sharing and can't wait to hear what Apurva has to say.
Thanks for Dr. Schiffman for passing it over. I think, the screening piece is so important, and I hope to kind of highlight that through a case vignette, and I'll be speaking about disclosure and school accommodations. So we'll start with a vignette. Mrs. Teak, an 8th grade English teacher, has noticed that one of her students, Shivam, has been having declining grades. He was previously a straight A student, he had many friends, and he aspired to become an electrical engineer like his father. She's noticing that he's been withdrawn, his hygiene has been declining, and he stopped turning in his homework consistently. And recently, he submitted an essay which was difficult to understand and contained themes of him being monitored by shadowy spirits. And she's had these concerns for the past 2 months and is quite worried about him. So she collaborates with the school psychologist and Shivam's parents on a referral to a child psychiatrist for evaluation. And this was done after she conducts a screening questionnaire for Shivam, which screened positive. So Shivam ends up going on to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he started on medication. He joins a CSC program, which was described in the first of these talks. And his parents also signed up for Psychosis Reach training to better support him at home. And that is an evidence-based cognitive behavioral treatment program for caregivers and loved ones who have a loved one with psychosis. With this sort of treatment, his hygiene improved, but he really continued to struggle with concentration and completing schoolwork. And his grades were still pretty poor, and he was struggling socially. So Shivam and his parents are still developing their understanding of his diagnosis, and they actually have not shared anything with the school yet. And the supported education specialist in the CSC program offered to help, and we'll talk about what that is. Before I get to that, I wanted to share a quote by the amazing Dr. Ellen Sachs. So dropping in and out of your life for psychosis or treatment in a hospital isn't like getting off a train at one stop and later getting back on at another. Even if you can get back on and the odds are not in your favor, you're lonely there. The people you boarded with originally are far, far ahead of you, and now you're stuck playing catch up. Ellen Sachs is a professor of law at the USC Gold Law Center and also is a person living with psychosis. She has written some amazing books and articles as well. So part of this coordinated specialty care program, which is the evidence-based treatment program for people experiencing psychosis, it's a multidisciplinary team model where you'll have a psychiatrist, psychologist, therapists, case managers, individuals who are part of supported employment and supported education, peer specialists. It's a real big team working with this family and the individual. And I'm going to focus on supported education today. And this is an individual who knows the education system, knows financial aid, especially for kids going on to college, knows about personal supports that students may access, and also is aware of various academic accommodations. And so know that if somebody is part of the CSE program, and if that program has supported education, they may have access to this supported education specialist. So there are several principles that I wanted to talk about when we think about supported education. So access to education, especially, sort of having expectations of recovery is reasonable, and we should have that. If a student wants to go to school, they should be able to, and they should be offered all support so that they can achieve their maximum potential. And that includes getting, supported education services through the school, through their programming. We know that early intervention is better, so not waiting until like the end of the semester before we start implementing or accessing some of these services. Ideally, educational supports are integrated with mental health care. We know that these services should not be time limited. Psychosis symptoms can ebb and flow and can be more intense at some times and less intense at other times. And so these services should really be ongoing and not be like 2 sessions. We know that these principles or these services should be client driven, so kind of thinking about what does this student really want? What are their goals? And how can we best help this person achieve their academic goals? If we go with that approach, it's more likely to be successful because you will have engagement from the individual. And then also coming from a strengths-based approach. So identifying what are the students' strengths and what are some of the challenges that they're facing and how can we best support them with those in mind. And also instilling hope is really important. Also, the role of the student, I think, is also meaningful. So knowing that, everybody has purpose in life, and having that purpose is a meaningful part of being on this earth. And so the role of a student is important and meaningful. So we're going to talk about disclosure for a second, because I think this is really important. And I have seen a lot of families kind of juggle this. So what we know is that individuals and their families need support and time to achieve an understanding of the illness. And challenges with disclosure may stem from stigma, can come from cultural factors, intergenerational trauma, and other factors. So know that this might be a very difficult thing for a family or a student to talk about, even with educational staff. Disclosure can sometimes improve relationships, so it can help others understand what one is going through, and also provide context to school staff for missed school, missed homework assignments, that kind of thing. In the elementary, middle, and high school setting, disclosure of diagnosis is often required for a 504 plan or IEP. If the student discloses their diagnosis of psychosis to you, it's really important to acknowledge them, praise them, and offer support, because it was probably something that required a lot of courage to approach and share. Students may also need support in reconnecting with their friends or family. Experiencing a first episode of psychosis can be devastating and lead to a lot of damaged relationships. And that's where educators have a unique opportunity to assist with this, especially in the classroom, where maybe you know of a kid that has psychosis, but has been having a rough time maybe reintegrating with his or her friends, and sort of kind of setting up the classroom in a way where it might support that individual. So when we think about different levels of disclosure, there are a few things that go into this. So the first thing is we have to think about, what is the purpose of disclosure? What do you hope to achieve, or what does that individual hope to achieve by disclosing? We also think about with who. So is this somebody that's trustworthy, that you know really well, that you think might have a good understanding and comfort, or is it someone that's brand new? And what is the situation? So a low level of disclosure involves telling things about yourself that are not highly personal. So an example could be, I missed some school because I was going kind of through a rough period, but things are much better now. And I appreciate your interest, but I don't really want to talk about it right now. So kind of giving a real surface level response if someone's wondering about what happened. A moderate or high level of disclosure involves telling more personal things about yourself. So when I was going through that rough time, I was very confused about things and I felt like I wasn't safe. And I even did some things that don't make sense now, like staying in my room all the time to feel safer. So, sort of giving more details about what the experience was. And at a very high level could be disclosing the actual diagnosis and or treatment that they are receiving. It's important to keep in mind that most people very gradually will increase their level of disclosure as they spend more time with each other and are more confident that they're going to be understood and accepted. So just things to keep in mind when we're talking with students and families about the diagnosis. So there are educational rights for children and teenagers experiencing psychosis in public schools. There are 2 federal laws that guarantee a free and appropriate public education and provide services or accommodations to eligible students. And so the 2 laws are Section 504 and IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We know that students with psychosis, or even students at risk for psychosis, also known as the clinical high-risk population, they may be eligible for and benefit from these types of educational plans. So I'll briefly go over Section 504. It defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The evaluation process is different from an IEP in that it does not need to include formal testing. You do consider a variety of sources of information. So doctor's notes can be helpful, parents' notes, test scores, teacher or staff observations. It is important to know that a medical diagnosis is not required under Section 504. And once that child has been deemed eligible for accommodations, then a 504 plan is developed. And it's important to know that 504 plans do not have parent participation as an entitlement right. So it really just depends on individual school district rules. Moving on to IDEA. So to qualify for under this law, a child has to meet the criteria of at least one of these 13 disability categories that are written in the law. And most typically we see psychosis or psychosis-related diagnoses fall under what they call serious emotional disturbance or other health impairment. This evaluation process is much more intensive. Schools must first get written authorization from that parent or guardian before they can even start the process to evaluate the child. Eligibility for this is also determined by a qualified team of professionals, and it can include the student's teachers, the school psychologist, principal, parents, and other school personnel. And they use information from a variety of sources similar to the 504, including doctor's notes, formalized assessments, that kind of thing. It's important to know that these assessments can be really helpful for the medical staff actually evaluating these students, and these are of no cost to parents. When a child qualifies under this program, then they receive something called an individualized education planner and program, IEP. And per this law, children with these disabilities must be taught in the least restrictive environments. The goal is to try to keep them in the regular classroom as much as possible with the appropriate related services and aids. And removal from the classroom should only occur when the severity of the disability is such that even with those additional accommodations or services, the child is just unable to learn. We know that the child has to be evaluated every 3 years, and schools have access to federal funding for specific services for children who qualify under this. In addition, I think something that's really relevant to people experiencing psychosis is that IEPs often include a transition to adulthood or college planning piece, which can be very helpful for students experiencing psychosis as they think about, okay, what are their future plans? How can we best ensure their success as they grow up? So there are a variety of accommodations that can be useful, and I highly encourage you to check out these 2 amazing resources written by Dr. Schiffman and a very large group of experts. One of them is called Supporting Students Experiencing Early Psychosis in Middle and High School. And then there's another one called Engaging with Schools to Support Your Child with Psychosis. And so these are available online, they're free, and you can download them to review in more detail. I just wanted to go over one of the boxes in those documents that I think could be helpful. So common educational interventions for individuals with psychosis are really based on individual needs. So we are thinking about, what is this student coming and sharing that they're struggling with? What are their strengths? What are parents noticing? And what are we noticing? And how can we kind of best address it? So We know that school-based counseling can be helpful to address psychosis symptoms, review school-related stressors, kind of working collaboratively on goals, maybe even helping with social well-being. And also, it's really important that school-based counseling should not replace like externalized therapy. So like therapy from a early psychosis program. They really should be receiving that specialized treatment if available in their community. There's also medication accommodations can be very helpful as well. We know that school nurses can help students administer medicine at school. Teachers can allow students to leave class to take medicines or even address side effects. I would also, mention that some of the medicines that we use make people really drowsy and tired. And so if we know that someone is taking that kind of medication, then maybe moving like tests or really important classes to later in the day where they may not be experiencing those side effects. Alternative environments can be very helpful. So having quiet spaces to complete work or take exams, having alternative content and assignments based on what their needs are, having preferential seating. Note-taking assistance is something that I see really commonly that students really appreciate, having class notes ahead of time or having recording devices or other ways that they can have assistance in taking notes, because one of the things with psychosis is that it makes it really hard to multitask and do multiple things at once, and also focus on paying attention and listening. So that could be a real big help. And that's that. Another place I want to mention that you can get ideas for accommodations is this website, acentral.education. And essentially you can kind of search based on the individual student's needs. You can do a search thing and it'll show you different ideas of accommodations that may be helpful. So I thought we thought to share that. So going back to our vignette, Shivan's parents disclose his new diagnosis to the school, and he ends up qualifying for an IEP. And his IEP testing showed significant difficulty in working memory and concentration, which is a pretty common experience in people experiencing who have schizophrenia. He slowly improves over the next 4 months. And before starting 9th grade, his high school met with this supported education specialist, Shivan's parents, and Shivam to collaborate on a plan for high school. And remember, this was a straight A student aspiring to become an engineer. And so this is really important that the high school met ahead of time to sort of plan out what 9th grade would be like. They agreed to continue his IEP. He actually does well in his first semester with a limited academic load. So instead of kind of loading up on a lot of advanced classes, he took mostly regular classes. They also included extra study periods and other accommodations like note-taking and testing accommodations. And that really led to a successful first semester for him. He did so well that he was eventually able to join the school tennis team and even make some friends, which was great to see. And Shivam ends up graduating high school and going on to pursue college. And he ended up switching his idea of becoming an engineer into going into business marketing. So I want to end with a quote from Ellen Sachs again. What I rather wish to say is that the humanity we all share is more important than the mental illness we may not. Without proper treatment, someone who is mentally ill can lead a with proper treatment, someone who is mentally ill can lead a full and rich life. What makes life wonderful, good friends, a satisfying job, loving relationships is just as valuable for those of us who struggle with schizophrenia as for anyone else. And here are some references. Thanks everybody for your time. And I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Adelsheim to lead the Q&A.
Thank you both so much for your wonderful presentation and the incredible amounts of information. As we've been asking during the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in that Q&A piece so that we can be sure we can touch on them and get them addressed by our speakers. So I want to start out sort of asking you a couple of questions related to this. If a parent, came to you as a school mental health professional, either employed by the school or as a community provider, wondering how the school might help their child who may be having some of these symptoms, where would you first send them within the school, or what would you suggest they do to try to get those supports put in place that you were referencing? Either of you.
I can take that one. So first, I would start with acknowledging and thanking the parents for coming to them, because I think that's the first step. And a lot of families don't even make it to that point and don't even begin to advocate for their child. So praising them is super important. The second thing is, first of all, thinking about, is the child receiving treatment of any sort of, have they received a diagnosis? And that may help guide on what kind of accommodations might be helpful. I think that, and it's always a conversation, and involving the student is really important in having that student also have an equal seat at the table if they're able to and interested. I usually start by first figuring out, okay, have they been diagnosed, and what kind of treatments are they getting, and how can we be helpful? And what are the things that their strengths, what are that student's strengths, and what are the things that their work still need help with? And then maybe looking through that accommodations table to see what might be helpful to that student. And of course, if the student is not in treatment or it hasn't even begun that, I think really knowing community resources and maybe even building partnerships with local mental health agencies to know where to refer these kids for specialized assessment and treatment.
I'll chime in real quick on that, sort of complement that, which is like I love Purvis quote from Ellen Sachs, the last one, yeah, about what Ellen Sachs was saying, just how people are far more similar than they are different, irrespective of their status with respect to psychosis. And you saw that in some of the recommendations and like the accommodations that Purvis mentioned in hers, that list was accommodations that would help anyone who was struggling academically. And so I think in that light, if a person is needing services or supports, the first person to turn to would be their school counselor, and then see if they can get the information, or the school counselor can understand and learn and listen to them as individuals, and then if they need to go beyond that, then that's what they do. But start where everyone was.
Have you, thank you both for that. Have you seen any of the particular accommodations actually that you've seen be particularly helpful, maybe some more than others, in supporting young people with some of these early signs? Apurva, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I have, and this is, for the middle school and high school students, I think they have to juggle a lot, right? Depending on the school you're at, you're going into different classrooms multiple times a day. There's a lot of social dynamics. That age in life is really challenging socially. I don't think a single one of us would say, wow, we loved our middle school puberty experience. So there are all these other factors that go into that. So some of the accommodations that I've seen super helpful are assistance with organization, or sort of like offloading a little bit of that. And having like notes and things given to the student ahead of time so that they can annotate on top of the existing notes. Having access to recordings or being able to record things in class has been helpful. And also just being really mindful that if the student is taking medication, right, we're not putting like their math or English class first thing in the morning, because oftentimes mornings are really tough to be sort of awake if the medicine is kind of making them tired, and then it's sometimes makes it wear off later. So just being mindful of the schedule as well. And then extra study periods, that kind of thing. Slow ramp ups. If this was a student that's like, I used to do AP classes and I really want to get in there and take all those classes, I would recommend a slower ramp up. So maybe taking one AP class, and then if that goes well, then you can slowly increase it the next semester, kind of adjusting it based on that.
And again, I think all of this is brilliant and spot on. But I also think at the same time, the real art in this is to be creative with the individual. So while there are some things that are probably going to work for most folks, making sure that you understand what the student in front of you needs and how to implement it for them and their schedule and their teachers is really going to be important. And some of that individualization can come in different forms, like educating their teachers in different ways, or understanding that the climate of as stigma exists within their school and how you might want to address that, or addressing safety in a way that you might not be able or typically do for a kid that has some other mental health challenge. So all those the generic interventions or strategies need to be custom made for the unique person that you're working with.
Thank you. We just have a couple minutes left, and we have some complicated questions here. One of the ones that I think you might be able to address a little more quickly is, one of the first questions was, really in terms of age of onset of psychosis. And someone asked, can a 5-year-old experience psychosis? Or I guess, really the question is, at what age should we be thinking about, a young person maybe being at risk for psychosis, or be looking out more for those kinds of issues in our students?
So I'll jump in, and then you feel free to amend anything. What we know sort of through science is that the origins or the seeds of psychosis are sown very, very early in life, prenatally. In fact, with the evidence to suggest that there's strong biological components. We know that genetics play a large role in the origins of psychosis, although it's a polygenetic disorder. So we don't know, there's no gene test or anything like that. That being said, the clinical manifestation or the manifestation of symptoms of psychosis tends not to emerge until later in life, adolescent years. So roughly on average 15 to 25 or so. For some folks, we can begin to see some early maybe behavioral signs that aren't as clinically relevant as maybe like beginning to hear voices or having unusual ideas or suspiciousness of like. And those tend to right now be fairly nonspecific. So they're not so great at being able to predict who will and won't in a very actuarial or like practical or applied way. So all that is to say, look for the true symptoms. And then with respect to the ages, some people have documented cases of instances of psychosis at a very young age, like 5, 6, 7, but it's exceedingly uncommon. You get more and more likely to be looking at true psychosis as you get closer to 15. But like 12 to 15, it's still possible. The main thing that I'll suggest there is to make sure that you have a conversation and you talk to the person and you talk to informants that surround them, that know them. And just a quick anecdote. This was when I was in Baltimore, but I got a call to do an evaluation for, I think, a 4th grader. So it was 9, that was saying that he was hearing voices. And the punchline of the story is that this clever 9-year-old really didn't like math. And he learned that if he said that he heard voices, that he would get out of math tests. So he was only hearing voices when he was about to take a math test. And so fortunately, for his situation, in his case, he wasn't experiencing symptoms of psychosis, but he was understanding how to pull the strings of his environment. So I think for kids that are like 12 or younger, it's really the burden of proof is on me to show that this is truly psychosis. Otherwise, my hypothesis is that it's something else. So in that case, I was able to understand the full context and get some clarity into it. But certainly there are some situations where a very young person.
Yeah, and I'll add,
let me jump in, Apurva, because we're almost out of time, and there's sort of one question that keeps coming up, and I need brief answers to a really long and complicated question. But a number of people are asking about, if you have young people in your schools that are experiencing some symptoms of psychosis. And one of the questions was around, if they're religiously related kinds of questions, and how do you then address treatment when they're religious related situations. Or another one was referencing if someone is hearing voices that they think could be telling them to take on a homicidal act or something, and they're trying to figure out how to address those in the context of school or linking to services. Do you have any just suggestions about how to interface with the school or family around, getting a better sense of these sort of more urgent situations, or in sort of addressing them in such a way, or how do we enhance our partnerships with school administrators and others to be able to keep everybody getting the care they need and keep the school safe at the same time?
I can speak to sort of a little bit of that. With the student that makes homicidal threats, I think that's a really challenging situation. And it can evoke our own fears and anxieties about the world that we live in. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a really tough situation that sometimes teachers are put in. So having school threat assessment teams can be very helpful. Those are now, as from my understanding, are supposed to be standardized now in all public schools. And it's essentially like a multidisciplinary team that sort of tries to figure out how can we best help the student and keep everybody safe. The other thing that I want to mention about, the religious aspect. So, there are some belief systems and some religions where, it's sort of a shared experience where like you might hear the voice or have a certain experience, and that is within the realm of normal cultural experience. And I would not necessarily call that psychosis. But if that cultural experience or religious experience is sort of taken to an extreme that's going beyond the shared understanding of what that culture is or what that experience should be like, and it's now starting to like maybe functionally debilitate somebody in a way, then I would be a little bit more curious, and I would want to really maybe assess that and kind of see and just be curious about, okay, tell me more about what you're experiencing and how it's affecting you.
Okay.
That might warrant an evaluation.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that wise response to a really complicated question. And we need to leave things here at this point, but let me just thank you both for your wonderful presentations and your thoughtful answers and your linkages to these wonderful resources as well. So thank you both very much. Let me hand things back to Jessica to close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone. Apurva, if you wouldn't mind just pulling up the slides really quickly for me. We are getting close to the end of our time together, everyone. Again, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. It really has been a pleasure bringing this session to all of you. A reminder that today's presentation slides and recording, as well as access to a certificate of attendance, will be sent to everyone in a follow-up email within a week. We also plan to make these materials available on the MHTTC website for all who attended, and those who maybe weren't able to join us today will be able to access the recordings and materials from this learning series free of cost. I do want to remind everyone that we have session 3 scheduled to take place in 2 weeks at the same time as today, and we will focus on the transition to college for youth with psychosis. We invite you to register for this next session if you haven't already, and my colleague will plug the link into the chat box for you to register. On the next slide, I just want to remind everyone that we ask you to complete a brief survey about today's training. You'll be automatically redirected to this survey upon closing the Zoom webinar. And this survey is for us to receive feedback on the quality of this event and for us to continue to receive funding to be able to bring these types of events to you all. We'll be sending the survey link in our follow-up email to everyone who attended today. And we invite you to just stay connected with us. We want you to learn more about the MHTTC network and the different mental health resources we have available for the mental health workforce. We invite you to follow us on social media and subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter. We also invite you to visit the PEPNet website and to join the PEPNet listserv to learn more about work and resources related to early psychosis that may be of benefit to you. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. A special thank you to our speakers and to Dr. Adelsheim for leading the Q&A portion of our session. We hope that you'll join us again on November 15th, and we thank you for your time. Please take care of yourselves and have a lovely rest of your day.